Hello, this is Edward Lambert at Effective Demand Research, and this is going to be a video explaining the relationship between potential GDP and labor share. So I'm going to show that potential real GDP reflects labor share. And in doing that, we're going to have to understand what potential real GDP really is in reality. So here we start off with a graph where I show real GDP minus potential GDP through the years. So when you see the line go above 0, real GDP is higher than potential GDP. When the line is below 0, real GDP is below potential GDP. So this 0 line is really potential GDP. And you see real GDP moving up and below this line. And you'll see that really potential GDP is the center of the business cycle. It's not the top end of the business cycle like a lot of people think. It's the center of the business cycle, and the data here shows that. So that trying to think of it as 200 billion is the top side and the low side. This is in 2005 dollars. That you can kind of see a range of 200 above, 200 below. 200 above, 200 below is kind of the normal range of the business cycle when you look at it in 2005 dollars. So that's the important thing to realize, is that potential GDP is really the center of the business cycle when you look at the actual historic data. Now I'm going to bring in the view of labor share. And I'm going to create I'm going to bring in a new line into this graph. Now you can't see the line yet. It's a red line here on the 0. This line is going to be capacity utilization minus effective labor share as a percentage difference. So it's capacity utilization minus effective labor share divided by effective labor share. So you get the percentage difference. I'll explain that better in the post. And then I'm going to multiply it by an amplitude constant. You can see up here the business cycle amplitude constant. I'm going to be raising that. Right now it's at 0, so this whole line here of the difference between capacity utilization and effective labor share is 0, because I've multiplied it by 0. But I'm going to be raising that amplitude constant, because right now the capacity utilization is a percentage, the effective labor share is a percentage. And I'm looking at the difference between the two of those as a percentage. So it's a very small number. You can realize that it's less than 1, so I have to amplify it by using the amplitude constant. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start raising the amplitude of the difference between capacity utilization and effective labor share. So you can see that it's growing as I'm adding billions of dollars to this amplitude constant, or to the difference between capacity utilization. So let's just stop right here. When you see the red line above 0, capacity utilization is above effective labor share. When you see the red line below 0, capacity utilization is below effective labor share. And so effective labor share is now this 0 line. And you can see capacity utilization moving below and above it. Now before, potential GDP was the 0 line. Now effective labor share is the 0 line. That's the connection being made here. And that's how I'm going to show that potential GDP reflects labor share. So let's keep raising this constant. You can see that the lines are starting to come together. So now follow these lines. They move very close together. See how these red and blue lines start to move with each other very closely? This is reflecting the business cycle of real GDP over potential GDP. But at the same time, it's reflecting capacity utilization over effective labor share. So you can say real GDP is like the utilization of capital, and potential GDP is like how much money is paid to labor effectively. according to effective demand. Now here, in the 1991 recession, the lines split. The government basically said that real GDP went a lot lower, below potential. But according to capacity utilization, it wasn't that deep. The recession wasn't that deep and recovered fairly quickly through the 90s. And then in around 1998, after the profits hit their maximum in 1997 right here, capacity utilization started to decline back down. But the government was saying that real GDP in relation to potential GDP was still rising, even though profits had been maximized back in 1997. So the government data is really in question here. I go by capacity utilization in relation to effective labor share, to really know where the business cycle is. But then you can see that here's really the end of the 1991 or 2001 recession, sorry. As the economy started to bounce back up and the lines came back together at about the beginning of 2003. And they started to move again, like they're supposed to during a business cycle. But then once again, real GDP fell below the red line like it did back in the recession of 1991. The government thinks that GDP is a lot lower below the potential than others might think, or than the capacity utilization would have us indicate. So real GDP went below, way below potential here after the crisis. It's just because the government is still thinking that potential real GDP is high up here at the zero line. But if you just look at this trend here of capacity utilization in relation to effective share, which held very constantly for 20 so years, more than 23 years, something like that. And the correlation between the two was over 85%. There was a high correlation, and then the correlation through these years went way down because the government had a whole different concept of what a potential GDP was during those years. But then they got back on track, and the correlation came back together. But now the government is still trying to hold on to this traditional, this historic potential GDP, and saying that there's this huge output gap. But in reality, capacity utilization in relation to effective labor share is saying there's really not that much of a gap. We're still within the business cycle. We're still moving within the business cycle. Yes, it went down very far like it did back in the Volcker recession, but not this huge output gap like the government is thinking now. So now you have information coming out recently saying that the potential GDP is not as high as people really think, which would effectively move this blue line upwards and closer to the red line. So this is basically so just to recap here, the relationship is this zero line. It's potential GDP. You have real GDP moving up and around it. And the zero line is also effective labor share, where you have capacity utilization moving up and around it. And you can see that the relationships are very close. And that's the way they're supposed to run. So potential real GDP reflects labor share, or labor share reflects potential GDP, because when they both sit at the zero line, real GDP and capacity utilization move around them in a consistent pattern.